The New York Times breaking another clear bombshell, revelations about what the paper calls Donald Trump's 2-year war on multiple investigations into his activities and presidency. This report details Donald Trump's extreme and potentially illegal efforts to thwart federal investigators, and they note it started just weeks after he took office. Now, before I go any further, let's be clear. If the themes here in this big report, which has the White House nervous tonight, if these themes are familiar, given Trump's public tirades against the FBI and rats and people who cooperate with law enforcement, that familiarity does not make this news tonight, this story, normal or okay. And tonight, legal experts are already weighing in, saying the Times account is chilling. We'll speak to several in a moment, but let me give you the facts. Donald Trump reportedly inappropriately pushed his acting attorney general to override Justice Department policy to install an ally to take over a federal probe in New York, which was looking into Trump's own payments to women as well as any liability for his 2016 campaign. New York Times revealing for the first time Trump's own White House lawyers were also separately so worried about what they viewed as false statements made about his firing of Mike Flynn, they put together an entire confidential memo detailing the White House's own falsehoods and, yes, lies. The report also looks into how Trump's efforts go beyond Twitter tirades and a more secret set of strategy sessions trying to get congressional Republicans to use their power on the Hill to attack or undermine Mueller. Now, the New York investigation is especially crucial. As we've reported on this very show, federal prosecutors there are famously independent. Their work can outlast Mueller on the timeline. And they were the prosecutors who threw the book at Michael Cohen and have, of course, this open probe that involves that National Enquirer drama that everyone's heard about. Well, the Times is reporting that Trump tried specifically to get DOJ to get a loyalist to take over the probe. This was as the feds were bearing down on that hush money trail that dates back to 2016. The account specifically is Trump called his own new acting attorney general, Matt Whitaker, who'd replace Sessions, and pushed for a Trump ally, a lawyer named Jeff Berman, to take over that probe. Now, Berman was seen as so close to Trump, he'd already recused himself from the New York probe, a kind of a New York echo of Jeff Sessions' decisions that so angered Trump in the original Mueller case. Now, that was the request. That's big on its own. This New York Times report, though, is that Whitaker refused. Now, you may know from following these kind of stories, that's the kind of leak that would obviously benefit Whitaker, who just left his post as acting AG. It benefits him more than it would benefit Donald Trump. And then the report notes again, against Trump's interest, that he, quote, soured on Whitaker. But what does not help Whitaker is that he just denied that Trump ever pressured him like this under oath earlier this month.
At no time has the White House asked for, nor have I provided, any promises or commitments concerning the special counsel's investigation or any other investigation.
Now, the key language there is any other investigation. Tonight, Democrats saying this report is, quote, very concerning, and it's a reason they want Whitaker to at least clarify his testimony. The Times raises the concept of, quote, perjury. We can't report yet whether the House views it that way. That's yet to be determined. Now, only Donald Trump knows where he may have legal vulnerability and where he may not. It's possible that he has no vulnerability anywhere in the country. Totally possible. But this story links with something that we've reported earlier on this show when documenting the legal pressure points of those prosecutors in New York. They have jurisdiction over Trump's business and some of his campaign, which is why it was so striking that Trump took that unusual step of personally interviewing the very lawyer the Times now reports he wanted in charge of this probe. Just like Donald Trump took the unusual step of personally interviewing the now famous lawyer, Preet Bharara, who originally held that post when Trump took office. That was in that Trump Tower meeting, which had no precedent from any presidential transition in history. It brings me no joy to tell you that these are the cases we've been following, that this is the office we've been following. It just happens to be what the Times is zeroing in on tonight. None of this is normal, and the Times makes that explicit, writing, Donald Trump's attempts to defang the investigations has been voluminously covered in the news media to such a degree that many Americans have lost track of how unusual his behavior is. And in this piece tonight, they go on to say, fusing the strands reveals an extraordinary story of a president who's attacked the law enforcement apparatus of his own government like no president in history. Like no president in history. This is real stuff. It comes right now as a new attorney general is overseeing Bob Mueller. Like no other president in history, we should note that Donald Trump's own allies who know about the law say the key investigation he would need to control, the dangerous one, was in New York.
I think that the Mueller investigation is not the president's biggest problem, and that the Southern District of New York investigation has always been much more dangerous.
I've got some very special guests to break this all down. Maya Wiley, former counsel to the mayor of New York, who also served as a civil prosecutor in that very division, the Southern District. Bill Kristol, director of the group Defending Democracy Together, as well as former RNC chairman Michael Steele. I'm going to move in a row, starting with Maya. When you see the office where you used to work back in the headlines from this New York Times report and the effort to get Whitaker to do it, what comes to mind, and is this itself potential elements of intent or obstruction?
Well, first of all, what comes to mind is exactly what you said, Ari, which is that this is not normal. And we have a sitting president of the United States who is behaving as if he has committed a crime. Whether he has or not, we don't know, but his behavior is the behavior of someone who has something to hide. And what's important here, and one of the things that I think all of us who've worked in a U.S. Attorney's Office are proud of, are the independence of those offices. In other words, career public servants who just work very hard to get at the facts. And in this case, we expect nothing less.
What does it say to you that Mr. Berman, who may not be a household name, but was the person that was personally interviewed, as I emphasized, both recused, meaning followed the rules, but also that Donald Trump thought it would help him to get Berman back in charge?
So the important thing here is that Berman is recused and has recused himself. And if he cares at all about his reputation, he would not fall subject to any pressure from Donald Trump to endanger his own career, because he has made clear that he cannot serve in that role. It is outlandish that a president asked, although with this president, as you pointed out, we have a lot of history of this, looking for people who will protect him, not protect us, not protect the country, but protect him personally. And that's what we're hearing out of this news story.
Bill Kristol, this is very real. Mr. Whitaker was pressed on and under oath, as I mentioned. Let's look at that exchange. This was February 8th, very recently, talking about this very New York probe. Take a look.
Did you ever have any conversations with the president about firing or reassigning any personnel, U.S. attorneys or others who work with the Southern District of New York? With the president or anybody at all? I want to know whether you talked to President Trump at all about the Southern District of New York's case involving Michael Cohen.
I am not going to discuss my private conversations with the President of the United States.
Bill, how do you read that answer?
Well, you could say that's just, you have some right to not discuss conversations with the president. That's a version, I guess, of executive privilege. You could also say he was being careful there not to lie, but also not to offend the president, he was still acting Attorney General then. His other answers, you could argue, is carefully wordsmithed, so as perhaps not to be a flat-out misstatement or a false statement. So, but look, Congress obviously needs to call Mr. Whitaker back and see what the truth about all of this is. And it does fit in. The biggest point to make is the obvious one. It fits into such a pattern of this president not wanting the truth to come out about a host of matters, but maybe most centrally the 2016 campaign in Russia, but also what he did as president with respect to everything from Michael Flynn to the firing of James Comey to conversations he had with Whitaker to conversations he had with Michael Cohen. I think we will know because of Mueller and because of the Southern District of New York. But I mean, the degree to which if you just step back from the trees to the forest, and as we've discussed before, that's so hard to do with this president. There's so much stuff, and it's every day is something new, and you sort of forget. Can't you remember what was the things you went 3 weeks ago? The absolute consistent red thread running through everything is he does not want the truth to come out about a whole range of his own dealings, and he's gone pretty far, not as far as some of us feared he might go yet, in trying to prevent the truth to come out, which, final point, maybe Congress should do a couple of little things like, make sure they get access to the Mueller report and so forth, that they can do more here to help preserve the institutions, which so far have managed to resist most of the efforts, it seems, by the president to corrupt them.
Michael?
Yeah, I think Bill largely hits that right on the head. And just to sort of encapsulate the president's mindset here, I think it's all that insular time that he has with himself, imagining all these enemies coming at him from these various angles, and then believing that he can use the institutions of government as a cudgel to block and break and sort of push back those folks who are coming at him, whether it's Mueller, whether it's congressional investigations, and certainly trying to find friends who will go out and be his mouthpiece, who will protect his interest, to Bill's point, his self-interest here, not the overall governmental interest, not the overall national interest, but his own personal interest. And I think that's what has animated and pushed this president to the point, to Maya's first point, that he looks guilty, he acts guilty, he sounds guilty, and whether or not all of that is true remains to be seen on what Mueller and the Southern District come to the table with.
Right. And when you mention all that, I mean, Michael, as a head of the Republican Party, you dealt with people at the White House, right?
Yeah.
You would deal with presidents sometime.
Yeah.
Because you're an important guy, is part of the point, but that's not my main point.
Just a guy in a room.
My main point is, in that role, you have a visibility that's different than the legal side, which is just the what the heck is going down when Corey Lewandowski, I'm going to read from this article, is one of the most loyal Trump people you could find, even after he got fired and mistreated. And then you have Trump even called his former campaign manager Lewandowski over the 4th of July weekend, patriotic, asking him to pressure Sessions to resign. Lewandowski was non-committal and never acted on the request. Number one, Michael, the Times takes its sourcing seriously.
Right.
The report is there's 2 people on that call. Number 2, have you ever had a president or a high-level person ask you, as a political guy on the side, to get involved in the removal of the Attorney General?
No, it is so outside of the box. And certainly for someone like Corey, who is a campaign guy, he's a political guy. He's not an administration guy. He's not a government official. He's not someone connected to legal counsel's office. So what Trump ultimately was looking for, Ari, was a political solution to what he saw as a legal problem and what he saw as an administration problem. So he figures, all right, fine, let's just going to put it all in the same box. I'll have Corey make the call on Sessions to get Sessions out of the game. And the fact of the matter is, as Corey rightly understood, I can't do that because, number one, that's not my role. And number 2, that then puts me in an incriminating position.
Yeah, and I don't mean any.
Subsequently.
I think you nailed it. I don't mean any disrespect to Corey Lewandowski, who I've had on the show and who I'll be willing to interview again. But look, what are you doing if what you're doing is too Trumpy for Corey Lewandowski? I mean, that's a line. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I mean, you were struck by the same thing I was, I think, which is, well, what's the sourcing for these stories? We have 2 phone calls, at least, in the Times story. A Trump-Whitaker phone call, which presumably no one else was on, and a Trump-Lewandowski phone call. We now know about both of those phone calls to the disadvantage of Trump and to the advantage of Whitaker and Lewandowski. It makes me wonder, and Whitaker's just left as acting attorney general, maybe he told other people who told the Times. That's quite possible, but he did choose to tell other people that. So it has a slight feeling of the rats leaving the sinking ship here, honestly. I mean, when you get these kinds of stories where an awful lot of people who were close to Trump, this isn't,
but you're calling them rats. You sound like the president.
That's terrible. That was terrible. Okay, so small furry animals leaving the sinking ship.
Hamsters, maybe? I don't know. More lovable.
Good. Hamsters
what are we looking
cute.
for?
Yeah, I like hamsters. That's so, you know, I mean, that just strikes me as maybe things are changing in the sense that people are worried now about where this is all going, and they're distancing themselves.
Which is so important. It brings me back to Maya Wiley, and maybe we'll call them cowardly bunnies, which are a lovable furry animal. But bunnies also have an obligation to cooperate with law enforcement. If they could talk. Look, I'm stretching. The point is, I'm going to read one more thing before we go for your analysis, which fits with Bill's point. Sean Spicer, in this leak here, according to falsehoods about Flynn, quote, Mr. Trump orders him say that, something that wasn't true about the Flynn firing. But was that true, Mr. Spicer presses, according to the New York Times account? Say that I asked for his resignation, Mr. Trump repeated. And in the same account, and again, we're 15 minutes into the show and we're not done with all the bad things in this story from the Times there. Another, to Bill's point, another furry leak, if you want to call it that, that suggests someone's trying to say, hey, whatever happened there about falsehoods about Flynn, I wasn't really trying to do it. I was caught on the wrong side of it. What do investigators do with all this?
investigate. And with this, I mean, what's interesting about this, Bill's point about Matthew Whitaker is he had briefings from Mueller's team, right? I mean, he says he knew and what was going on with that case, and he goes before Congress and says something that later, if he is leaking it, to Bill's point, he's leaking something that makes him sound inconsistent with testimony he made before Congress. So all I can say is there are a whole lot of folks who have a lot to worry about in terms of their behavior. And some of that will be reputational. Some of that could be criminal. And if people are in the process of trying to now protect, at minimum, their reputations, who have some sense of what's coming down the pipe, that tells us something.
Right.
And there are furry creatures involved.
There are furry creatures involved, but it tells us that people have a reason here as Barr takes over to further get out ahead of things on these calls. Look, you don't have to know as much about Washington than Michael and Bill know to decode the leaks of two people on a phone line for a story that's terrible about Donald Trump. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.